Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Ellis, Executive Director of the Charles Pankow Foundation and past chair of the Structural Engineering Institute's Global Activities Division. Thank you for joining us today for this very timely program, The Future Impact of COVID-19 on the Commercial Development Market. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Global Activities Division for developing this program. The Global Activities Division is responsible for increasing SEI's members' awareness of global issues that impact our profession and facilitate the development of skills that will allow SEI members to thrive in the world market. The Global Activity Division promotes global interoperability and encourages participation in global structural engineering activities. Currently, the division has two subcommittees, which are always looking for volunteers. The Global Credentials Committee assumes a leadership position to enable global structural engineering credentials. And the Interorganizational Collaboration Committee is in charge of establishing and advancing a plan of partnerships with other international structural organizations and with domestic organizations as well. I'd also like to thank the SEI's Futures Fund for their financial support of today's program. We will begin the program with our keynote speaker, world-renowned economist, Dr. Anirban Basu, Chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group. Anirban is a study of contradictions. He's been called an economist with a personality, or alternatively, one with a sense of humor. He has twice been recognized as one of Maryland's 50 most influential people. He's also been named one of the Baltimore region's 20 most powerful business leaders. In 2014, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan appointed Dr. Basu as chairman of the Maryland Economic Development Commission. He also teaches global strategy at Johns Hopkins University and serves as the chief economist for a number of organizations including in the construction industry around the United States. More importantly, Dr. Basu has read every one of Agatha Christie's novels. He's an avid fan of James Bond, English football, Indian cricket, and all Baltimore teams. After Anirban's presentation, we will transition into a panel discussion moderated by Anirban. Our panelists include John Roberts, John Price, and Ann Thompson. John Roberts is an independent consultant at Priestland, and he's chief engineer at McGee. Today, he will represent the perspectives of the UK market. John Price is a senior resident engineer at Killa Design, and for the purposes of our discussion today, he will represent the Dubai market. Ann Thompson is a licensed architect and the executive vice president of architecture and design at Related Midwest. For the last 25 years, she has led Related Midwest design and planning across the company's portfolio of mixed use, mixed income, affordable, and luxury developments, as well as all engineering, zoning, and entitlement efforts. Ann received her master's in architecture in 1992 and currently serves on the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign Alumni Advisory Board. So let's get started. Anirban?
Righto, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. You just heard a wonderful introduction from Ann Ellis. We actually also have an Ann Thompson here today on the panel, and then two Johns. So if it's poker, it's a winning hand because it's two pair. And then you've also got an Anirban, but still I think the hand is a winner. So my name is Anirban Basu. As Ann pointed out, I am an economist. Please hold any further applause. I've been asked to talk a bit about where we are in the economic cycle right now, what it means for commercial real estate and commercial development. But I think the big winner here is going to be the panel. And at that point, you'll have a chance as well to ask via the chat questions of that panel. I'll also ask some questions of the panel. My presentation, which should last about half an hour, is entitled Anirban Basu and the Chamber of Data. Yes, this is a Harry Potter themed presentation. And you'll see that theming throughout this presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it is sort of baked into the cake. I think you would agree that the most salient factor shaping economic and real estate outcomes in 2020 and in 2021 continues to be this globally shared pandemic and the shifts in behavior that it has rendered. We have been prisoners of our homes, of course. And so we'll talk about some of the impacts that it has had on the value of proximity, office buildings, hotels, other forms of commercial realty during the hour and a half roughly ahead. So again, thank you so much for being with me. Now, despite the fact that this has been a shared experience, a shared global pandemic, outcomes around the world have been vastly different. And part of that is attributable to the fact that the response has been different across households, across governments, certainly across nations. And so this is a reflection of what happened in 2020 economically. These estimates come from the International Monetary Fund. This is estimated growth and output for select global areas in 2020. Now, there were some nations that managed to expand economically last year. If you look toward the bottom of the slide, the estimate for Chinese economic growth is that last year they grew 2.3%. There's some irony there. The Taiwanese economy grows 3%. The Vietnamese economy grows 2.9%. They're not reflected on this chart. But you can see that much of the world does not expand economically. The United States, for instance, we'll talk a lot about America, today shrinks 3.4%, according to the International Monetary Fund's estimate. America's Commerce Department, the US Commerce Department, estimates the loss of GDP at closer to 3.5%, but not the worst performers in North America, that's for sure. The Canadian economy is shrinking an estimated 5.5%. The Mexican economy, 8.5%. If you look at Europe, the French and Italian economy is shrinking 9%. The Spanish economy is shrinking 11%. And the United Kingdom, and we'll be hearing a lot about the UK today, the United Kingdom has its worst year since 1709. Many of you might remember that was the year of the Great Frost. Last year, the GDP in the UK shrank 10%. But for the most part, a really tough year for the global economy, and all things being equal, that would not be good for commercial real estate and commercial development. But we're going to talk a lot about that in the moments to come. There are many implications to a shrunken economy. One of them, of course, pertains to the labor market. Let's talk about jobs. This is monthly change in US jobs. I'm going to show you in this presentation a combination of US data, Canadian data, and some global data as well, but we'll really have an opportunity to explore much of the rest of the world during the panel discussion to follow. So again, this is monthly data, February 2002 through February of 2021, 19 years of monthly data. There are blue-colored bars here and red-colored bars. The blue-colored bars stretch until February of 2020 and are indexed to the left-hand vertical axis. I had to bifurcate the vertical axis, which sounds and is excruciatingly painful. And I'll mention why I did that just in a moment. Now, February of 2020 is a month during which America adds 289,000 jobs. There was plentiful momentum in the US economy coming into this pandemic. February of 2020 represents the 113th consecutive month of job growth in America. Over those 113 months, America adds 22 million net new jobs. It drives its official rate of unemployment down to 3.5%. That was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. I'm from Baltimore, I know these things. Now the pandemic begins to influence the economy in North America in March, at least in a significant fashion. There was some effect in February as well, as it turns out, not necessarily the labor market, however. So in March, America starts to lose jobs. March of 2020 represents the first red-colored bar, and those are indexed to the right-hand axis. And in March of 2020, America loses 2.7 million jobs. Sorry, 1.7 million jobs, 1.7 million jobs. And now normally that would be a big news, but that was merely the appetizer. For the following month, the nation loses 20.7 million jobs. So if you do the math on that, between March and April, America loses about 22 million jobs, precisely the number of jobs added during the previous 113 months. An economist surveyed around that time, the spring of 2020, by the Wall Street Journal, most economists who work for large US financial institutions, not small business operators like myself, collectively forecast that America would lose 8 million jobs in May, further adding to the nation's misery. But the nation did not lose 8 million jobs in May. It added 2.7 million of them, followed by 4.8 million jobs in June, and 1.7 million jobs in July, and 1.6 million jobs in August, and 716,000 jobs in September, and 680,000 jobs in October. There was this big debate in the economics community about whether the initial phase of recovery from the pandemic would be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, hockey stick, check mark, square root. It was a V, ladies and gentlemen. And that is important to consider as we talk about the forecast for 2021 and beyond. Under the right circumstances, the US economy has demonstrated the ability to recuperate very, very rapidly. Now, we'll talk about why this is in a moment, but by December of last year, the economy is losing momentum again. In fact, it started losing momentum as early as October of last year. By December, it's actually losing jobs. It loses about 309,000 jobs in December. And again, we'll talk about why that is. And despite the fact that the early phase of recovery was quite rapid, America remains very far from complete employment recovery, of course. So if you compare February of 2020 employment to February of 2021, America is down 9.5 million jobs. Which sector has lost the most jobs? Leisure and hospitality. That's mostly your restaurant worker and your hotel worker. And obviously, we're going to talk about shopping centers, we're going to talk about hotels, we're going to talk about office buildings, all of that. But one of the impacts of this, of course, has been on near entry level and entry level workers. And one of the other things that this has done, this pandemic, is it has widened pre-existing socioeconomic disparities. And we'll talk about that in an engineering and architectural context. Was muted and now I'm unmuted. Okay, so very good. So you can see here every major sector of the US economy has been impacted by this, but again, leisure and hospitality, which includes that hotel sector, has been most forcefully impacted. Now, let me talk a little bit about the regions of the United States. This is a reflection of the performance of the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. February 2020 versus February of 2021. I'm just taking the percentage change in the number of jobs supported by each of these regional economies. Now, it's a mistitled slide, that's for sure. There is no job growth here. Every one of the nation's largest metropolitan areas has lost jobs on a year-over-year basis, but some regions have held on to more of their pre-existing employment base than others. Which regions held on to the most jobs? Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, not enough that they won a Super Bowl. They've been the best performers among the 25 largest metropolitan areas during the pandemic. Who is the governor of Florida? Well, it's Ron DeSantis, of course. Ron DeSantis, one of these governors, very keen on keeping his state's economy open. And number two is San Antonio, who's the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott, one of these governors, very keen on keeping his economy open. At number three, Phoenix. Who's the governor of Arizona? Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey, again, one of these governors, very eager to keep his economy open. At number four, Dallas. Again, that's Greg Abbott. Skipping to number seven, Atlanta, Georgia. Who's the governor of Georgia? Brian Kemp, of course. Brian Kemp, again, one of these governors, very keen on keeping his economy open. So some governors have been very fixated on the economic and employment outcomes. Other governors more focused on the public health outcomes. I'm not here to tell you which is a better approach. I'm simply suggesting the obvious, that these policies or policy differences have major economic implications. If you look at the bottom of the second row, Orlando, Florida ranks last, losing the highest fraction of its pre-existing employment base. Now, you say, Anirban, Florida, that's Ron DeSantis, same state, same governor, what gives? What gives, of course, is the structure of the Orlando metropolitan area economy, which is about theme parks, leisure hospitality, retail trade. It's about in-person experience, not about remote work, not about e-commerce, And so that regional economy was structured to really be damaged by a pandemic like this one. At number 24, Los Angeles. At number 23, San Francisco. Who is the governor of California? Well, it's the wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom. Himself could be a Hollywood actor. He has kept that economy fairly aggressively shut down. Not himself necessarily shut down, as it turns out, but himself, he's been out and about, as it turns out, but that economy shut down. And so you can see the effect of some of that in the labor market statistics. At number 22, New York Metro. Who's the governor of New York? Well, I think everyone knows at this month that it's Andrew Cuomo. His counterpart in New Jersey, Phil Murphy, again, very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. New York City, of course, was an early stage viral epicenter in North America. They shut down mass transit as a result. And when you shut down mass transit, you're effectively shutting down much of that region's economy. So again, policy, economic structure all factor into these data. What about unemployment? This is the final slide of this part of the presentation. Well, as I said earlier, we came into the crisis with a 3.5% rate of unemployment. By April of 2020, we're at 14.7%. Here I offer some additional granularity. I'm showing you total unemployment in red, male unemployment in blue, and female unemployment in green. During the Great Recession, men suffered relatively more in large measure because of the 2.3 million jobs lost in construction during the period of that economic downturn. This time was different. Women have been hit far harder economically, and that shows up in many different ways statistically, but one of them, of course, is in the form of unemployment. So in April, when the overall rate of unemployment was 14.7% in the US, it was 16.1% for women, 16.1% for women that month, 13.6% for men. Now you can see the improvement since the early stages of the pandemic. By February, the unemployment rate is 6.2%. And if you flip this line upside down, and why on God's green earth would you do that, is because on this slide, less is more. The lower the number, the better. So if you flip this line upside down, you would see the letter V. V for vibrancy, V for vindication for economists who thought it would be this way. Now, I'm not suggesting, again, we're anywhere close to complete recovery, of course not. And this is also somewhat misleading. Since February of 2020, about 4.3 million Americans have left the US labor force. So if you were to add those folks back into the ranks of job seekers, the unemployment rate would be closer to 9%, which is probably a better reflection of where America is right now economically. Nonetheless, there is some evidence here of tremendous recuperative power. Now, one of the other implications of 2020 was significant involvement by governments in the economy, including the US government. So in 2020, 3 major stimulus packages passed by Congress and signed by the then president. The first one was signed by Donald Trump on March 27th of 2020. That was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. That was a $2.2 to $2.3 trillion package. Less than a month later, more stimulus is offered to the economy in the form of, for instance, more monies for the Paycheck Protection Program. But then after April of last year, no new major stimulus is legislated by Congress for many months. The economy by this point is recovering. Again, we added those roughly 2.7 million jobs in May, 4.8 million jobs in June, so on and so forth. So, the economy is coming back, no new stimulus. But what does that mean? That means that those stepped up unemployment insurance benefits that were part of the CARES Act, those lapsed in July. The paycheck protection monies ran out by August. And so after that point, the US economy begins to decelerate. By October and November, as we'll talk about, retail sales begin to slump. By December, we're losing jobs. Sensing that the economy was buckling, late in 2020, the government passes more stimulus, a $906 billion stimulus package. So 9 months to the day after he signs the CARES Act, Donald Trump signs the Consolidated Appropriations Act, more direct payments to Americans, more extended and expanded, enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, rental assistance, and more loans and grants for small businesses. Now, of course, this news has been elapsed, or eclipsed, I should say, by the newest stimulus in America. New president, of course, inaugurated on January 20th, Joe Biden of Delaware. On March 11th, he signs a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, more direct payments to Americans, more enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, but this time was different because this one also offered direct financial aid to state and local governments. The first 3 stimuli did not offer direct financial assistance to state and local governments. Don't get me wrong. There was a lot of money flowing from the federal government to state and local governments, but it was prescribed money. It was money for particular purposes, to buy protective equipment or whatever it happened to be, to basically bulk up health care capacity. This was different. This was offering general fund relief to state and local governments. If you remember in 2020, there was this big debate on Capitol Hill about whether or not we wanted to bail out states like New Jersey and Illinois. That was all the rage in Washington, D.C. Do we really want to send general fund relief to those states and bail out states like New Jersey and Illinois? As it turns out, in America, there's a fair amount of antipathy toward people from New Jersey and Illinois, which I think is perfectly crazy, as I think those are perfectly delightful people, at least those from Illinois. Again, the stimulus included more money for small business, public health, so on and so forth. Now, many Americans and others are asking the question, are we being Dumbledore? Albus Dumbledore, of course, the headmaster of Hogwarts School, Hogwarts made famous by the Harry Potter books and movies. I'm told the greatest headmaster in Hogwarts history. We came into this crisis as Americans with a $23.5 trillion national debt. It is now past $28 trillion, and by the end of this federal fiscal year, will be above $30 trillion. And one of the things you might have heard is that the Biden administration is talking about a $3 trillion infrastructure package. There'd be more than infrastructure, also some tax increases to support that package later this year. So we're not done with stimulus in America yet. But one of the things that we have to worry about, of course, and I think people in commercial realty in particular, is what does this mean for the future of inflation and interest rates? What does this mean for the cost of capital and therefore for development in the years ahead? Now let's talk about some other aspects of pandemic impact. So one of the other aspects of 2020 was that we suffered a lot of large-scale retail bankruptcy, and as a result, we have even more vacant retail space in America. Here's some of the large retail bankruptcies suffered in the US in 2020. So in February, before the crisis really becomes one in North America, Pier 1 Imports goes bankrupt and closes all of its stores, though you can still buy their merchandise online. In April, True Religion, the supplier of those most excellent jeans that make everyone look slender, they go bankrupt in April. Then sequentially, J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, and JCPenney go bankrupt in May. GNC, the provider of those excellent supplements, those pills that many of us take to build up our musculature. I take them like crazy to build up my biceps. I still have the arms of an accountant. For whatever reason. In any case, they go bankrupt in June. Brooks Brothers goes bankrupt in July. Lord & Taylor, that Hallow department store, goes bankrupt in August. And then Francesca's, one of my daughter's all-time favorites. So many of these are my daughter's all-time favorites, judging by their spending patterns. They go bankrupt on December 3rd. Now, what's interesting about this to me is that last year was not a bad year for retail sales in America. Unable to take vacations, go to theaters, go to movies, go to restaurants in many cases, people bought a lot of stuff. This is monthly US retail sales, 21 years of data. Now, retail sales began to slump in February of 2020. Let's do some rewinding here. What's going on in February of 2020? Well, by this point, you and I have heard about COVID-19. Presuming that you're from North America, for instance, we've heard about COVID-19. Some people are beginning to withdraw from the economy, at least partially. They're canceling vacations or having vacations canceled on them. They're not going to conferences. They're not going to restaurants for fear of the unknown, for fear of infection. So retail sales began to slump that month. And indeed, the National Bureau of Economic Research has designated February of 2020 as the start date for this recession. Now, as we shut down the economy in North America in March and April, retail sales fall off the table. But lo and behold, what do you see here? A V-shaped recovery. By May, retail sales are screaming back. By June, retail sales are above their pre-recession highs. What happened here? Well, again, March 27th, Donald Trump signs the CARES Act. Some Americans are getting direct payments. Many Americans are getting direct payments. Some people are getting stepped up unemployment insurance benefits from the federal government. A lot of people made more money on unemployment during those months than they were at their previous job. And then many people don't lose their jobs, including many white collar workers who can work remotely. And so money is coming to the household, but it's not money easily spent. As again, the theaters are closed, the malls are closed, the restaurants are closed, and there's only so much Grubhub you can order. Now you can see into October, retail sales continue to climb sharply. So we had 2 or 3 bad months of retail sales, but after that, it's been pretty strong. So how do we reconcile that performance with all of that retail bankruptcy? Well, ask yourself the question, who won retail last year? So this is US retail sales by type of business, February of 2020 to February of 2021. So these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in retail sales for these individual sales categories. Who won? The internet won, of course. Amazon won. Jeff Bezos won. He's doing so well that he doesn't have to be CEO of Amazon anymore. I think he probably has enough to retire at this point. But now some brick and mortar retailers did fairly well too. Sporting goods, hobby book and music stores. Why? The sale of Peloton bikes and other exercise equipment. If you couldn't go to the gym, you put the gym in the house. Whether it's a rowing machine or a bike or whatever it happened to be, one of those steppers. Who else did well? Building material and garden supplies. What's that about? That's your Home Depot and your Lowe's. Because the housing market takes off in North America, and not just the United States. The Canadians can tell you how many people are purchasing homes in the Toronto area, the Vancouver area, Calgary, Montreal, Halifax, so on and so forth. And we'll talk about the implications of this for the value of apartment buildings and other real estate as we enter the discussion. But that was a part and parcel of the effect of the pandemic. It drove people into home ownership and often drove them into suburbs and out of apartment buildings in major North American cities. Now, where do you see the loss in retail sales? At the very bottom here, food services and drinking places. Food services and drinking places. Most human beings refer to that as restaurants and bars. We economists call that food services and drinking places, which is one of the many reasons that many of us have never been on a date. And then clothing and clothing accessory stores. What's that about? Well, we're not in each other's presence. We don't have to work that hard to look good. We're not with each other. I mean, question for you, am I wearing pants? You don't know, and I am not telling. So, you can see now, again, not a terrible time for retail, and yet all that retail bankruptcy. Now, let's talk about real estate. Now, if you are familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that any student admitted to Hogwarts is allocated into one of 4 houses. There's Hufflepuff, there's Gryffindor, and as it turns out, Harry Potter is in Gryffindor house along with his closest friends. I'm from Baltimore. And every Baltimore Wizard is allocated into Ravenclaw. It's just the rule. I'm not making it up. I'm just telling you what it is. For instance, wizards from Pittsburgh are always in Slytherin. I'm just telling you what it is. I don't make it up. If you don't like it, you can take it up with Hogwarts administration. Now, let's talk about commercial. Now, I mentioned earlier something you all know, which is that there has been this profound shift into the suburbs and this pretty meaningful shift into home ownership despite low inventory of unsold homes in North America. Let's talk about commercial real estate and construction. This is the Architecture Billings Index. It is, of course, followed by many in this audience, and it is a reflection of how busy architects are or are becoming. So if you see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide, any reading less than 50 means that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. And for many months during this pandemic, architects have been busily getting less busy. February was a change. This economy is coming back to life. We have had that V-shaped recovery. There's more confidence right now in the economic outlook for 2021 and beyond. We'll get into that. And so that was a bit of a shift. Nonetheless, there are many months during which steadily architects were becoming less busy. And part of the reason for that was because of what we built and how much we built prior to the pandemic. As defined by the US Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All of those 16 categories are reflected here, and these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in construction spending for the 5-year period spanning from February 2015 to February of 2020. Now, why do I stop the series at February of 2020? Because that was the last pre-pandemic month. So what did we build a ton of prior to the pandemic? Lodging. That's new hotel rooms, for instance. We built a ton of hotel rooms just before this pandemic. And now, of course, we hold these meetings on Zoom and go to webinar and other platforms. What does that mean for business travel? What does that mean for hotels around airports? or hotels with large meeting spaces in central business districts around the country. Well, we'll talk about that. Office. We also built a ton of office space just before a pandemic. And now what do we know we can do? We can work remotely in very large numbers and effectively and efficiently. See, here's the thing. Coming into the crisis, the conventional wisdom was, sure, as an employer, I can have my folks work from home and I will save on real estate costs in the process. I won't have to lease as much office space, but I will lose productivity. But what we have discovered during the pandemic is that many people are as productive or more productive working from home than in the office. As it turns out, the office is filled with distraction. These are human beings we're talking about. So they come into the office after that grinding commute in Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco or Seattle or Austin, Texas. And now what do? They're human beings. So they start contemplating other human beings. It's what we do. Then they go to the water cooler and start talking to human beings about other human beings. It's what we do. They might have some water. Then we have coffee break number 1, coffee break number 2, coffee break number 3, free Splenda. It's irresistible. Then an impromptu staff meeting of no value whatsoever, and then lunch. And then after lunch, filling out the NCAA bracket. So now again, don't get me wrong. There are distractions at home as well, and we know who and what they are. Pets, children, neighbors, daytime soaps, sports center. Nonetheless, reports or studies from the United States, Germany, China, elsewhere indicate that many people are as effective working remotely as from home. And here's the other thing, many of those folks prefer to work from home at least several days a week. They like it. So what does this mean for the future of office space? Well, of course, that's one of the things we're going to discuss on this panel to come. Now, this is a reflection of what's happened over the past year, same 16 categories. National non-residential construction spending, US data, but now the period of comparison is January of 2020 to January of 2021. If you look at the very bottom, where do you see the loss in construction momentum? Lodging, again, that's hotel room construction. Toward the middle of the slide, office, down 4.5%, but that is misleading. Why? Because the office category also includes data centers. And data center construction, of course, is fast and furious, along with fulfillment centers, as the e-commerce economy continues to boom. But traditional office-based construction, well, that is not particularly strong, and we can go into that more during the panel discussion. What about Canada? This is a reflection of Canadian non-residential building construction investment. A lot of data here, but you can see the second and fourth quarters of last year were terrible for non-residential building construction investment. So this is not infrastructure, this is buildings, this is building construction. Where do you see the most loss? If you look at the tabular data, commercial construction by the fourth quarter of 2020 was down nearly 14% on a year ago basis. And of course, Canada feeling many of the same effects of the pandemic as America. Globally, according to CB Richard Ellis, global commercial real estate investment surged 84% in the fourth quarter of 2020 from the third quarter of 2020, indicating recovery in investor sentiment, but volume for the full year was down 26%. So commercial real estate investment down 26% globally last year. Germany replaced the US as the top destination for foreign capital in 2020. Does that have something to do with Brexit? It may. London experienced a strong rebound of capital inflows in 2020 quarter 4, reclaiming its top position as the most attractive city for foreign investment. And that probably has something to do with Brexit and some of those dynamics as well. And then according to CBRE, investors are more likely to make opportunistic and distressed purchases in 2021 since total returns dropped sharply in 2020, greater emphasis now being placed on tenant credit and rent roll growth. This gives you some sense of global commercial real estate investment. So the orange line is global, the green line is Americas, the blue line is Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And then the green line is the Asia Pacific region. And in the Asia Pacific region, you don't see much evidence of a pandemic, do you? Well, of course, China grows last year. Now, what does that global line look like, that orange line? Well, it looks like that unemployment line I showed you earlier flipped upside down, as it turns out, right? Sharp drop during the early stages of the pandemic and a partial recovery during the latter stages or the more subsequent stages of the pandemic. Okay, so let's hit the home stretch a little bit here. Now, this slide is an awful slide, and I apologize for this. There's just way too much going on here. This is Las Vegas. It's overwhelming. But this, if you look at the left side of the slide, primary investment strategy, this is a reflection of global investor intentions based on a 2021 survey. So if you look at that pink or hot pink segment at the very top of that bar, that relates to distressed properties, and that has become a more appealing part of the primary investment strategy. So people are looking for owners of real estate that are weakened financially, and they're looking to buy some of their properties that are now distressed, to make money on the buy side of the equation. That's what you see. If you look at the dark green at the very bottom of those bars, that's core real estate holdings. And you can see that over the past 2 years, that's become more important. So basically what's happened is that the tail end of the distribution, the tail ends of the distribution have become larger. More emphasis on distressed properties, more emphasis on stable performance of core properties as well. Now, if you look at the right-hand side here, COVID's impact on operating strategy. So as I said, greater emphasis on tenant credit and rent roll growth, that makes sense, of course, because people are looking for safe income in this kind of environment. But there's also a stronger focus on long-term demographic and technological trends. We've talked about one of those demographic trends, which is the move to the suburbs in mass numbers. So on net, about 2 million people moved out of American principal cities last year. About 3 million people moved into suburbs. Technological change, of course, includes things like remote work, and Zoom meetings. Greater consideration of ESG issues. This is a test of how woke you are. That's environmental, social, and governance issues. Elevated interest in assets with redevelopment potential. So that could include Class B office space. More interest in decentralized locations. Well, obviously, because proximity lost some value last year. In an era of remote work, online shopping, and streaming of Netflix, proximity does not have as much salience. That helps explain why in San Francisco, apartment rents fell 27% between March and December of last year, and then introduction of flexible space in office assets. So one of the groups you'll hear about again this year, one of the companies is WeWork. WeWork got a new stake here, a new lease on life, because all of a sudden now many companies are saying we don't want permanent office space, we don't need so much of it. Flexible space might be where we're headed, and of course that's what WeWork is all about. Finally, the forecast. Let's do some crystal balling. Broadly speaking, the economy is demand and supply. That's one of the reasons that we focus on consumers so much, because in North America, about 2/3 of demand comes from the consumer. So this is the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment, and predictably, consumers are still ill at ease. They're in the midst of the pandemic. They're still waiting for their vaccinations. They saw that job loss in America in December. So, there's that. So when the folks in Michigan are not being hammered by Ohio State, they like to produce this index. Confidence is coming back just a bit, you can see here, but it's not back to where it had been. But here's what's interesting about this. I could make the argument to you that American consumer balance sheets have never been in better shape. Now you might say, Anirban, that's very insensitive. A lot of people lost their health insurance during this pandemic. A lot of people are facing food insecurity, having to go to food pantries for the first time in their lives to eat in America. A lot of people are facing eviction. You're right, because they haven't been able to keep up with the rent, all of that. But a lot of other American households have taken the opportunity to amass significant savings. This is the US savings rate. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. Now, coming into the crisis, the US savings rate is around 8%. By April of last year, which is the peak you see here, it's nearly 34%. What happened? Money was coming to the household from jobs, from stepped up unemployment insurance benefits, from direct payments from the government, but it was not money easily spent. As the economy reopens partially last summer, spending opportunities emerge, and those savings become expenditures, and the economy takes off, adding, for instance, those 4.8 million jobs in June. Phenomenal. But as late as February of 2021, the US savings rate is still a lofty 13.6%. So a lot of American households have money to spend. The issue right now here is that small business America is not yet ready to participate fully in the expansion. This is the National Federation of Independent Business Index of Small Business Optimism. Question, small business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? Answer, it is not. Only 6% of small business operators said yes to this question. So small business America is hoarding cash, looking to hold on, trying to survive, trying to figure out if their monies from Paycheck Protection are grants or loans. So the supply side is not fully participating in the recovery, and the demand side is still hesitant because we're still in the midst of this pandemic. The demand side has latent power because of those elevated savings. So what does this mean for the forecast? For an economy to flourish, both demand and supply sides of the economy must participate. With additional stimulus forthcoming, demand gets a further boost, but supply continues to be constrained by ongoing lockdown measures, and not just in America. Certainly that's the case in Canada, but also South Africa, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Ireland, England, many other parts of the world. The result is that the savings rate in North America will climb once again, spring-loading the economy for rapid economic growth once vaccines become more broadly available. So the back half of 2021 should be simply spectacular for economic growth in North America. The growth you're going to see, at least from the US economy, will be unlike anything you've observed in your lifetime, unless you're from Dubai or Shanghai. It's going to be phenomenal. However, and this matters for commercial real estate investors, there will be a day of reckoning as deficit hawks come back into fashion one day in the US because of this massive national debt. At that point, that could drive up interest rates, and that could make commercial development much more difficult. But I'll leave it at that. Let's turn it over now to the panel. We have, as I say, an all-star panel, and let me turn to those folks now. They've been introduced earlier, but let me introduce them once again. We have John Price, Senior Resident Engineer, Killa Design in Dubai. Killa Design, Killa. It's a name that a rapper would be envious of, and he is the Senior Resident Engineer there. So that's John Price. John T. Roberts, Independent Consultant, Chief Engineer at McGee, and Digital Consultant at Priestland. He is out of the United Kingdom. And then Ann Thompson, Senior Vice President of Architecture and Design, Related Midwest. I believe she's based out of Chicago, but she'll correct me if I'm wrong. Let me open it up now to these panelists. So panelists, are you with me? I see John Roberts, I see Ann Thompson, I see John Price. So let me start with you, Ann, and I'm going to, of course, ask also questions coming from this audience as well. But let me start off with some some easy pitches first that you can hit out of the park, and then we'll have the audience test you more aggressively with their fastballs and curveballs. So Ann Thompson, let me start with you. I spent a lot of time talking about the U.S. economy, and we certainly want to broaden the discussion to talk about global commercial real estate and commercial development. But here's the big question for you. How much of the change we have seen in the utilization of real estate, whether we're talking about office buildings or shopping centers or hotels, how much would you view as permanent, and how much of it is simply temporary and driven by this pandemic, and therefore will just return back to normal once these vaccinations proceed apace?
Great question, although a very big question. Obviously that's something we're tracking across the company. Obviously we have seen impacts from COVID, but certainly there's other impacts from political unrest, financial unrest in Chicago that's impacting. Notwithstanding that, we see a 5% increase across our national portfolio, which is very encouraging. As vaccinations take place in Chicago, we are certainly seeing increased activity, both in our for sale and leasing platforms, which is extremely encouraging. So while, we certainly are not taking a doom and gloom approach to what's happened in the economy. There's lots of talk about, what's going to happen to our economy, what's going to happen to our cities. We are firm believers in our cities as really the economic engines of our country. And we will double down on that investment moving forward.
That's interesting, Ann, because let me play devil's advocate here. Mm-hmm. And let me say that, or suggest that the future is really suburbs and rural areas. I'm just putting that out. I know, you're a Chicagoan, you have that mighty skyline, the Cubs and the White Sox, the Bulls and the Bears. I get that. When I was growing up, I grew up in Kankakee County, Illinois. I was a fan of the Chicago Sting. I love Chicago, don't get me wrong. But wouldn't you agree that with e-commerce, with remote work, that all of a sudden the value of being proximate to other people is not as great?
No, I completely disagree with that as a statement, to be honest with you. As I said, I look at COVID and what has come to bear over the last year is a blip. Cities are transforming. Cities are not dying. They are still, as I said, the economic engines that drive us. When we talk about remote learning or remote working and remote learning in some cases, and we talk about the productivity associated with that, that is if you are measuring task-based work. When you talk about collaboration and innovation, it is fundamental to be in a common space to do that. And offices will come back, our cities will come back, as a place for, again, culture and the arts. Our cities are just transforming. They are not going away. What's interesting about this pandemic is I think cities are transforming in ways that are really good. There's a renewed interest in how we develop our open spaces and public spaces in cities. There's a renewed interest in how we live in cities, because not only are they the economic engines in terms of our economies and our culture, but cities are still the most sustainable way to live. And that has not changed. So again, we double down on cities. We're a firm believer that this is a blip. This is not a long-term trend.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the pushback. And I suspect that many millennials and Gen Z folk agree with you that they want to be together in cities, that it is the most sustainable way. It's the way to reduce our carbon footprint collectively, and that cities are really the future. But John Roberts, let me turn to you out of the United Kingdom. I think you mentioned you might have been a Liverpool fan. I can't remember, but sorry, I apologize. More apologies. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't mean to cast aspersions. But so what do you think about this discussion of cities? Obviously, London is arguably the greatest city in the world. It is still the center of the world. And so, what do you think? What do you think about the future of cities, and how much of this pandemic is sort of temporary in terms of its effect on our behavior, and how much of this is permanent?
I think cities are bound to be still really important. I'm going to sit somewhere between the two of the things that the two of you have said. I think it's pretty much, there's almost too much infrastructure pointing at it, and also that need for social interaction, I think, is going to drive people back in. Cities have been developing for thousands of years as the biggest change since we came off the plains, and as in the ones full of animals, as opposed to those planes that aren't flying anymore. And I think the things we're going to see, distance, we're suddenly in 2030. That's the main impact of COVID. The fact that actually distance working, which I can remember sitting in LA next to a team talking about video conferencing back in 1996. It's here. We all got used to it. Internet retail, we had the UK had the biggest spend per head in the world before. We have absolutely doubled down on that. It is decimated retail. Retail's going to be completely different going forward. But I think, in transport patterns around what that's going to mean for trains and what that's going to mean for cars, I think people haven't thought that through properly yet. But I think that even if it's actually looking much more flexible workspace, shared workspace, people will still want to meet. And I think, then we're seeing a bit of emptying out of the city, or escape to the country, which is a very popular TV show over here. Some people are moving right off to the far ends of Scotland, but otherwise people are still maybe moving out to the centre and starting to set up home close in. I'm 25 minutes away, so that's the kind of distance people like. And at the same time, there's a big housing problem with people who haven't been able to access property, and I think a lot of young people are still looking to when things become more lively again, they want to be back in the middle of town. So cities aren't down and done yet.
Very good. And John Price, let me ask you a similar question here, which is about, from Killa Design in Dubai. John Price, I think you're on mute right now, but
yeah, sorry.
Let me ask you the same question about how. Okay, no, and it's an awesome top you're wearing, by the way. I gotta tell you, but how much? You with me, John?
Yeah, sorry, there was an interruption.
Can you hear me, John?
There's an interruption in the network. Sorry. Hello.
Oh,
I've lost.
yeah. Anirban, you keep freezing.
Lost him, I think, a little bit. So let me turn. Can you hear me now? Okay. Can you hear me now? I'm secured. I'm good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great, great, great. And is John Price still there? Am I the problem here? Is John Price there?
Yeah. Anirban, you keep
Okay, and-
freezing.
Let me talk. Let me mention how we do. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me, I don't know if John Price heard my question, but we got a question in the chat. So let me turn it over to Ann Thompson. Actually, Ann, I think you mentioned this a bit. The question is this from our audience. I was curious, what are your thoughts on the role of green open space, access to parks, greenways, trails will play in the real estate and development economy going forward? Ann, would you try that?
Yeah, I touched base on this a little bit earlier, but I think this is part of that transformation we're seeing in cities. And it speaks to two things. One, about our need for open space in dense areas. And I think that you will see a renewed interest, not only in the quantity of green space in the city, but the quality of green space in cities, whether that be, open green spaces in parks, rails to trails programs. But I think you'll see a much more renewed interest, both from the development community, from government agencies looking to push that and enhance the experience in cities. And I'm very happy to see this, because obviously it's something that I think this will move the ball forward much quicker based on what happened in the last year. The second aspect of that I think is really important is it starts to speak to, equity in cities, which is another topic that I think has been fundamental over the course of the last year. And when you start talking about open public space, it starts to reference equity in cities and access to that green space across a diversity of populations, which I think, again, is a real positive that you'll see come out of the last year.
Actually, and let me take off from there. Diversity of populations. One of the things that we've seen during the pandemic, and I think this gets to this whole notion of ESG, environmental, social governance issues, is of course that the socioeconomic disparities that pre-exist the pandemic have widened. What role, if any, does architecture and engineering, design work generally have to try to alleviate some of these socioeconomic disparities?
Well, I would argue that, architecture design has a real responsibility to address those issues in our cities and elsewhere. And I think design has the power to sort of bridge some of those divides, particularly in our dense urban centers. And again, when you look at what's happening in Chicago, while there's certain product types that are retreating, affordable housing is booming in the city, and our definitions of affordable and workforce housing are being developed and rethought. And I think, again, that's fundamental to this resurgence that I think we'll see in cities moving forward.
Now, John, thank you very much. And now, John Price, I think I got you back.
Yeah, we've restored the network. My cat has got off the router, so we're fine.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. Now, are you in Dubai today? Yes. Good. So Killa Design, I was going to ask you this question, and then, I guess I was freezing. I caused some issues there, and I apologize for that. But are the best days of cities behind them or in front of them, was my question to you. I mean, you're in Dubai, one of the world's great cities, a development miracle, really. What do you think?
I think it's behind now. They've remastered, there's a new 2040 master plan, and that really is to grow out into the suburbs, make the place greener and not taller. So yes, I think it's had its day, And then I'm just constructing now a 60-story hotel, residential, and there's very few now that are being started. They're just finishing some off. Some are just skeletons now. But what the plan is now is to move out into the suburbs and turn it green. So I think that's the way it's going to go now.
And do you think that that's going to happen in other major cities around the world, the same push into the suburban development, or just Dubai is a special case?
Let's just say this is probably a special case because we've just got loads of sand going that way. And that's the easy way to go. So I think it's a special case. So.
John Roberts, let me turn back to you. So, I think there's still a fair amount of pessimism regarding the future of commercial real estate, given the dislocations we've seen, given the remote work. Now, Anne, of course, is not a pessimist about cities and other things development, and that's terrific. But one could make the case that hotels that cater to business meetings are not going to be as busy going forward. One could make the case that remote work really is going to impact the demand for office space. One could make the case that we're going to have even more vacant shopping center space going forward because Amazon and other e-commerce giants are going to continue to gain market share, whether we like it or not. So if you're an architect engineer, from your perspective, what is the outlook for the volume of demand for design services as it relates to commercial development going forward?
I think the nature it's going to change, and one of the things we're seeing at the moment is the big volume schemes are not happening. There's quite a lot of very, very clever and very intricate interventions going on. The government's spending a lot on infrastructure. Sustainability is again, has jumped forward to 2030. It's really absolutely central to anything that happens at the moment. We're seeing a lot of cut and carve schemes rather than new builds. Some of the stuff that we're just winning in the middle of Covent Garden is not taking down stuff and putting it back together again. It's taking the middle out of things and creating new atria. That connection with green space, that connection with outside, the quality of the space. Because people really do not want to go back to what they perceived before as unhealthy 1960s, 1970s low ceiling environments. The idea of breakout spaces, natural ventilation, and everything seen to be much more green and connected and healthy is absolutely vital. So in many ways, I think we're starting to see even if it's not increasing the volume of offices and accommodation, we're seeing a revolution in those. I think it's true that retail is going to go at the out of town shopping centre. The number of anchors, you went through your list in America. We've had the same thing with Debenhams, and we've got John Lewis retreating, and all those other people that have been the absolute anchors that then drag all the people to take their footfall between them. That model's got a lot of problems. But at the same time, locally, a lot of the high streets, as the big stores disappear, are seeing. It was interesting what you're talking about, that the money in people's pockets has been building up if they've got money to spend. Independent retailers, specialist retailers, they're all actually kind of moving back into towns. And so there's an interesting flux going on where we're hoping, there's a discussion we're having in our local community, which is about how do you enable that to continue? Because it could be quite a nice kind of live-work space with new types of retail around it. So I think it's going to be different. It's quite exciting. I don't see big areas of new footprint being built, but I see quality going up.
And you see quality going up in the cities. I mean, I think you're siding with Anne to a fairly significant extent with the notion
we are picking on you.
You are, and
you said I supported Liverpool, so yeah, what do you expect?
Yeah, I know it's fair. It's a fair thing. I'm sorry, John, the other John, I should say here, John Price. What about that? What about this notion of sustainability and so on and so forth? I mean, if I am a driver of an electric vehicle, I'm driving a Tesla. Can't I make the claim that I'm going to my suburban office and I'm as green as can be, and I don't need to be in the city to be sustainable? I mean, isn't technology allowing me to lower my carbon footprint wherever I am?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm here representing the Institute of Structural Engineers, really, and the forefront of their main force now is climate emergency, sustainability, should we be building? Regardless of whether you've got your Tesla or you're riding one of these at the back of your bicycle. So it's, look, we've got to do something. We've got to do something now. Some say it's too late anyway. So I suppose whatever you do is going to help. So whether you're not you recharging your Tesla in your solar paneled office, let's see.
Very good. Now, one of our attendees asked the question, restoring mass transit service and ridership seems like it will be one of the squeakiest wheels in getting people back to work. What are your thoughts on how this constraint, the constraint on mass transit, might be addressed? And what about that? Obviously, Chicago is a heavily mass transit dependent city, one of the most mass transit dependent in the country in terms of getting people to work and back home again. What does that look like going forward?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, we're certainly seeing it, not only in our own office, but across, the cities in which we operate, that mass transit is really the squeaky wheel, and it's the problem to solve moving forward, getting people comfortable. Honestly, I think that's going to come with time, but I think it also goes into needing to have massive investment in infrastructure that includes public transportation, the kind of investment we haven't seen in some cases for decades. And I think those two things, again, this is another case where I think this pandemic can sort of catapult us forward in advancements in public infrastructure that we need. But I don't know that answer is out there. I certainly have not seen it or seen great examples of where that's being addressed as effectively as it needs to be.
Right, and it may be that the Biden infrastructure package will have a lot of money for mass transit, because that seems to be one of the directions. I mean, they're focused on clean energy and they're focusing on climate change in that package. And it seems that mass transit would be a natural way to try to reduce our collective carbon footprint. So we might see more support for mass transit systems than we've seen in decades in this country.
And I agree with you. I think for the first time, you're seeing a real coalescence around this as a topic, as an important issue to move forward.
John Roberts, what about you? There's a question here, another question, and I think, sitting there in England, I think you're very good to answer it. How about globalization? Are international companies to focus on domestic work for the long term? Meaning, what's happening with globalization? I mean, you've been watching Brexit along with everybody else for the last few years. Are we becoming more tribal? And is that permanent, or is that just a function of Brexit and Donald Trump, and that's just temporary as well, like the pandemic?
It's very interesting. I've just been working with one over the last couple of days with one of the government agencies looking at some of their procurement strategy, and they don't know, they're not saying it, but I can feel it going that way. I think when I saw one of the notes for this meeting which says, has globalization had its day? Of course not. But at the same time, I think actually people are going, in terms of sustainability, buying locally, in terms of supporting your economy, there's all these stories about a pound spent locally is basically creates £5, circulating. Whilst people are trying to look to get their local economies out of debt, I think the localization of the economy is going to be very strong. I think in the UK as well, after all the bruises that have come out of the whole Brexit process and all the damage we've done to ourselves, I think, even though I wasn't a supporter of that, in some ways that there are several good things about local industry, local economy that can potentially be now carved out of that. So I think a kind of just a tuning back of globalization is one of the things, but there's a lot of friction that's going to happen, because of course actually the world's been pushing straight ahead with that, and there's a lot of people very happy with the way that model's been going for them for a number of years, and that's potentially going to really upset them. So we'll see, but I think it's going to be one of the big things for the next 3, 4, 5 years about getting that balance.
Very good. John Price, let me ask you this question. If you're a betting man and you had to bet which segment is going to be strongest in terms of commercial development going forward globally, not just in Dubai, not just in the United States, not in Canada, globally, is it hotels, office buildings, apartment buildings, or shopping centers?
Possibly none of them. Picking up something that you were saying in your presentation, things like data centers are going to be a big thing. I think hotels, look, we've got 100% occupancy here at the moment, but that's because of the staycations. But we've got lots of hotels, we've got the rooms, and many of them. So I think globally, things that are going to provide internet traffic, so data centers are going to be the big thing, and for sure. Shopping centers, shopping malls have their day. We've not got enough here, but we won't be building any more here. More going back to what John was saying about the community, there are 1 or 2 more community malls going up. Resi, we've got too many houses. So I think it's some of the service providers that are going to be the bigger builders now, I think, in my opinion.
That makes sense. That's very interesting. And where do you think the strength is going to be in commercial development? As we come out of this pandemic, this economy takes off. That's at least my prediction based on all the stimulus and just the fact that these vaccinations are proceeding. And, at some point we're going to be able to rip off our masks and wave them in the air like we just don't care. So, what do you think is going to come back the fastest? Hotels, apartment buildings, shopping centers? What do you, the office building sector?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say a singular product type. I would probably focus more on projects and development centered around experience. And that's true whether you're a commercial developer and looking at office space, where office is a set of resources for collaboration and innovation as opposed to a sea of desks. I think you'll see in Chicago, we're seeing a huge focus, as I mentioned earlier, on quality, affordable, and workforce housing in a high-rise city center that we haven't seen before. And then again, in retail, it's going to be experience-based retail, as you said, with the Internet of Things. You can get anything you want on the internet, but what people crave is experience, and that's true in the retail sector as well. So again, and then the second piece of that is not just experience-based retail, housing, commercial, but also health and wellness. Project-centered, development centered around health and wellness. I think we'll see a resurgence across product types moving forward.
Very good, and thank you. We have another question here, and this is, I open up to all of you this question. How about outsourcing engineering services? Will it be going bigger and more popular because work from home is now viable? So does it make sense to outsource engineering more frequently? Any answers to that in terms of the way that engineers and architects work? John Roberts, I see you smiling. Oh, no, go ahead, John Price, go ahead.
Well, I can just put, that's what I moved from the UK to the Middle East 15, 16 years ago to do that very thing, was to run outsourcing centres based in and around the Middle East, Far East, the subcontinent. We were doing it 15 years ago, and some would say we're still not getting it right, and we're still doing it to this day. And I've got contractors here that are using centres in the subcontinent. So it's already big here. So, I'm not too sure about the US. Certainly, I do know that the major multinational consultants in the UK were, because I was involved in doing it. So if you're not doing it now, you're way behind the curve. So it can only get bigger and better.
Well, that makes sense. But Anne, as I understand it, a lot of the practice among architects in America has been the opposite, right? I've seen a lot of architects join construction firms. And so it's not about outsourcing, it's about insourcing and vertical integration. Do you see that continuing?
I agree with you. I have seen more of that. We have on our projects, we have not seen a lot of outsourcing, but you're right. We are seeing this sort of merge between the lines being very blurred between architecture, engineering, and construction, which I think is a very exciting prospect moving forward, and you're right, we're seeing architects move into construction firms, and vice versa. We're seeing some, architecture firms pick up construction expertise internally. And from our perspective in the projects that we're seeing a higher quality level of drawings when that is the case.
So you think that vertical integration is really very productive, as it turns out?
We do find that to be very productive, yes. And frankly, it's part of the model that our company is based on, is this sort of vertical integration within Related, and when we see it in our consultants, we're seeing the same kind kind of positive outcomes from that approach.
Very interesting. And John Roberts, what about you in terms of the way people work, outsourcing versus vertical integration? What do you see?
It's interesting what John was saying, that he was setting them up. I was out 13 years ago in India setting them up. So it's the big consultancies have it built in. I think actually it's probably not going to grow that much. I think it is just part of the way they work. But going back to that thing that actually now I think there's a whole host of more sophisticated interventions happening, because we have, in the UK, like a lot of places in the world, Dubai's been a kind of the new Wild West, where basically you're moving off into virgin territory. And so everything's a new build. But it is much more difficult when you're dealing with complex existing urban infrastructure to try and outsource that, because in some ways always you're going to you don't get that volume. You always have to then arrange somebody to go down and get that dimension that allows you to work out if something's going to work. And somehow it's much more touchy-feely and smaller projects as well, and all the things that don't work so well to be outsourced. So I think it will still be a big part, because there are things, we haven't talked about things like HS2, which is the high-speed 2 line, which is absolutely central to UK construction. Those sort of projects with the big consultancies will still have those kind of bits of volume that can be outsourced. But I think we're moving to a much more touchy-feely, localized architectural and engineering future.
That's very interesting. Now, John, let me stick with you. John Roberts, I should say. I have to be clear about that. John Roberts, let me stick with you. One of the questions we got also is about renovation and repurposing versus new construction. Now, I think you're hinting at some of this in some of the comments you've made earlier, that I don't know if you'd call that touchy-feely, but it seems to me in a place like England, where you've got a lot of older structures, you're always repurposing. Is that still the future?
That's true, but also, we're taking quite a lot of several of the schemes I'm working with at the moment are cutting large bits out of things from the 60s and 70s, which you wouldn't say were very attractive. But as the efficiency of buildings has come down, there's been this if you look at the last 20 years, and as the rise of energy efficiency, or should I say the drop of energy efficiency, but it was the fact that a typical building, the embodied carbon in it would be eclipsed by the operational carbon during its lifespan of 6, 7, 8, more times that. As we're now getting to the point where the regulations in the UK are basically starting to bring it down to parity, that the operational and the embodied carbon is about the same. People are increasingly not wanting to throw away the carbon that's already invested in a good structural frame. And that's one of the big ways forward now. If you want to score your top marks, both with whatever BREEAM or LEED rating that you're talking about, but just in terms of the marketing, it's much more central now that you really want to be able to convince the punters that you're giving them the greenest possible thing, and part of that is saying, look, it was repurposed from this thing in the past.
Very good. And of course, that's one of the ways that cities stay interesting. That's something that the suburbs often can't offer, is that authenticity and that history.
The depressing thing is I have also been involved in cutting and carving a building I remember building. So therefore actually coming back to it after 35 years is anyway, that's just me now.
Well, the 1970s were seemingly difficult for architecture. I'm an economist, but just looking at the world, anything built in the 1970s is often perfectly horrendous. And let me ask you this question.
I wasn't working in the 1970s, I have to.
Well, clearly that was the case. I mean, I knew that just based on what I see. So we have another question, and let me turn it over to you. Materials, construction materials, design materials. As we try to move toward this cleaner, greener world, where do you see the progress there in terms of material science and how, including recycled products in construction? What do you see there?
I think people are moving forward timidly. We're obviously a developer of fairly large projects globally. And I think because we are the owner and operator, we continue to own and operate our buildings, while there's a lot of emerging technologies in these areas, I will admit, slow adopters to these, to make sure to wait until they have sort of proved performance over time. But we are following it carefully. We are researching it, whether it be, timber structures or some of those things, we are following it. But we will, implement it slowly over time.
Very good. And John Price, one of the things that we've observed recently, and we might continue to, is that materials in general have become much more expensive. So steel, copper, softwood lumber. How is that affecting the world of development right now? I understand that in the United States, there are actually some home builders who've been returning deposits to their purchasers because softwood lumber has added $24,000 to the cost of building a typical single family home in America. And those home builders can't afford to make those homes or construct those homes at the agreed upon contractual price. So what do you see in terms of, from the perspective of Dubai and the Middle East, where materials prices are so important and often shaped by what happens in the Middle East? What do you see with respect to that and its effect on development right now?
We're not seeing too much of that. We're still going back to one or two of the questions that we had earlier on. We are still importing. We are still, I'm waiting for shipments coming in from China. I'm waiting for shipments to come in from the UK for various builds. So we're not really affected too much by that cost. We don't have timber, so we're not affected by that. But look, I mean, there were one or two developers that are starting to certainly on the resi side, looking at 3D printing of developments, small ones, just to test out what's happening with it. So obviously there's some cost involved with setting all that up, but once that gets going, then there are actually going to be reductions in the price of materials. But it's still a way off, I think. So we're quite stable with that cost. But yeah, I mean, it is affected worldwide. That's
very interesting. And of course, we just saw the Suez Canal reopen, and I think that was a I've
probably got something on that boat. So
yeah, I figured as much. That's $9 billion of commerce interrupted per day, $400 million of commerce interrupted per hour. So that was a sort of a huge deal. So John Roberts, let me ask you this question. What will be the effect of Brexit on the UK economy? Has that shaped your outlook for design and whether engineering or architectural work in the United Kingdom? How has that reshaped your outlook over the last few years, if at all?
I'm trying to, if I had it goes back to your slide with the crystal ball on. If I had that, it would be wonderful. So exactly what there's been a lot of short-term fallout as various different exporters have struggled with paperwork. From what I'm hearing, people are starting to get used to the new system, so that's kind of starting to sort itself out a bit more, and so we move much more into long-term trends. If I look at construction, and especially in actually throughout the market in the last 15-20 years, Eastern European skills and labour has been very, very important, and I think there is a concern that the cost of labour is going to go up, and there's going to be shortage around getting the right sort of people who can support your projects. But a lot of them now have the right of residency or nationality here and have been in the market for a long time. So we wait and see. But I think we haven't seen panics about material costs. It was interesting you mentioning that. I was thinking, gosh, actually that hasn't been a feature of the last year where people panicking about the cost of materials. People are worried about, with some of the big infrastructure going on, trying to get hold of a diaphragm walling rig with high speed 2 happening in the background. That's an interesting case, and exactly how many cranes, some of the nuclear power stations, Hinkley Point, and then Sizewell C coming up, all those sort of things are going to be quite important. So I think people are more concerned about availability of equipment and skills with the big infrastructure projects rather than the cost of materials at the moment.
Right, and you've mentioned high-speed 2 a couple of times. So that's a proposed high-speed railway in the United Kingdom serving London, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Leeds, or alternatively London, Manchester, Liverpool, Preston, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, but not Sheffield. In any case, it's under development right now.
It potentially is going to Y and do both of them, but actually it's a big political football. But at the moment, they've started from the south. They're heading north up to slightly beyond from London to Birmingham. And it's pretty live. I think there's still debates every now and again about whether or not it should stop, but I think it costs £8 billion to stop it now.
Well, that's wonderful. We, of course, in America have Amtrak, and therefore are the envy of the world, as it turns out, with respect to rail. And let me ask you about this. So, I asked about Brexit. Let me ask you about Chicago's outlook. The city of big shoulders, the Windy City, the second city. Chicago was one of those cities that suffered a lot of unrest last summer, along with Minneapolis and many, many others, Portland, Oregon, so on and so forth. What effects, if any, do you think that has had on economic momentum and development momentum in those urban centers?
Honestly, it's had a significant impact, and I think as great as the pandemic effect on our economy and our ability to develop moving forward. There's a lot of discussion and talk about how to bring more equity into cities. We also have a pension crisis to deal with in Chicago that is affecting our ability to develop here. But really dealing with, I think, some of the social unrest and the issues that have been raised moving forward will change the way we develop. There are some kind of innovative strategies being tested and some legislation trying to be put in place to increase the ways in which we develop and incorporate affordable and workforce housing in the central parts of our city that I think, again, will change the makeup of our downtown area for the better.
Very good. John Price, you've talked about Dubai. There was about 15 years ago, a real concern that Dubai was going to be a bubble that was about to burst. And yet, given all the new construction and all those high rises, it was just magnificent. What's the future of Dubai economically? Still very bright, or are there some challenges going forward?
It's still very strong. Yeah, I mean, yes, 15, 16, yeah. It was in around 2000, 2007, 2008 was, it dropped like that. I was working on a shopping centre at the time, which managed to breeze through those 2 or 3 really tough years. We were buying concrete off barges in the sea. You don't bring that up in a progress meeting, black market concrete. But anyway, and then it rose, and then it hit another dip. But no, we're coming out on the other side of it. It's still growing again, but it's moving towards different areas now. So it's got a boom. There's no oil here now in Dubai. So it's got to move towards the things like tourism. It's got to look towards providing these healthcare holiday type sort of thing. It's very agile. The government's very agile and very quick to move, put legislation in place, do whatever they need to do to become what they want to become, the world's best city in 2040. So watch this space.
Right, and of course, major airlines headquartered there, financial centers. You mentioned the tourism.
Yeah, I mean, two-thirds of the world's population is within 4 hours flight of Dubai.
It's really quite remarkable. So it really is a model for how other resource-intensive cities can diversify their economies and develop even after the resource has been largely expended. So it really is something else. We have a question here from the audience, and I'll open up this to all of you. The pandemic affected the senior population around the world more than most populations, more than all populations perhaps. And many of those seniors decided they didn't want to move into institutional settings. They didn't want to move into assisted living centers, nursing homes, even continuing care retirement communities. What do you see as the future of senior housing? And I open that up to all of you in your respective communities. Anne, do you have any idea on that, the future of senior housing?
A little bit. We are not heavily active in the senior housing sectors, but I think this will go back to our comments about health and wellness in our residential centers, and that applies to senior housing as well. I think we will have to rethink what urban or what senior living looks like moving forward in the same ways that we're relooking at affordable housing and residential high-rise in cities, with a greater focus on green space, greater focus on health and wellness associated with those product types.
Very good. Anybody else on senior housing?
Yeah, It was interesting. You skipped past me earlier when you were asking the others about which sectors you thought were going to be
Oh, sorry, go ahead,
taken
John.
off. But my top three is quite straightforward: residential, residential, and residential. It's the and so in some ways I'm not going to, yes, we need better housing for seniors, especially those who want to live independently. But that's going to be part of, I think, much better housing stock. Just because you're living in the UK, I've owned 2 houses built in 1860, just because those are the ones you buy. There's been a big effort in terms of improved insulation, improved heating systems, improved accessibility. But then sometimes, the land value has pushed it up, so you then actually start making spaces too small. A very interesting thing now about people working from home more and about having the space to do that. So I think going forward, the whole thing about having properly accessible, houses that are energy efficient, access to green spaces that suit young people and suit seniors. And also, I think if we're starting to look at enlivening the middle of our towns, I think having those two communities there and able to spend money in immediate proximity to it is one of the things that's going to keep the high street bubbling along.
Very good. Yes, and I agree. It's housing, housing, and housing. But Anne mentioned, I think earlier, very early in this panel discussion about affordable housing. And I think that there's an insatiable demand for affordable housing in the United States, in Canada, throughout the world. And my hope is that material science will help us along that dimension too. If we can manufacture housing much more cheaply, we can make standard high quality housing more accessible. And that would really help solve many of the world's issues.
We have the problem in the UK that just land value is so high. So in some ways, the cost of the actual house is a relatively small part of that, small part of the house.
Yeah, and all of you tried with Brexit to destroy those land values, and you still couldn't do it.
It's still going up.
England still remains a very valuable place. It's crazy. It's just, you can't ruin that country no matter how hard you try. So very good, wonderful panel discussion. I'm told now that I need to hand it back over to Anne Ellis, our moderator. I want to thank all of the panelists, obviously Anne and both Johns. Thank you so much. And sorry to everyone for my technical difficulties earlier, but I think we got through those. Anne Ellis, take it away.
I hate to be the one to close this out because it was truly informative as well as inspiring. Thank you, Anirban, John Roberts, John Price, and Ann Thompson for spending your time with us and enlightening us. You've given us an awful lot to think about. I'd also like to thank again SCI's Global Activities Division for hosting this event, the Futures Fund for supporting it, and the SCI staff who makes it all happen seamlessly behind the scenes. And to all of our participants, thank you for the generosity of your time today. Before everyone leaves, please complete the exit poll about to appear on your screens, and we wish you all good health and good business.